The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Jason Palmer.
And I'm Rosie Blore. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
One of the most profitable pairings in the artificial intelligence world is Microsoft's patronage of OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT. Our columnist argues, though, that the best move, and a likely one, is for Microsoft to let OpenAI loose on an open market.
And today is Remembrance Day, when many countries remember their war dead. In Britain, people often mark it by wearing a poppy. But in recent years, that symbol has become rather controversial. First up, though. Today, in Baku, Azerbaijan, leaders are gathering for COP29. With 2024 virtually certain to be the hottest year on record, the stakes for this annual UN climate summit are high. They were raised even higher last week when Donald Trump was elected for a second term as US president.
We will drill, baby, drill.
Last time he was in office, he pulled America out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So what, if anything, can COP achieve?
This year's COP is about dealing with the last hanging issues left over by the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015.
Oliver Morton is a senior editor.
One of those is international ways for trading carbon cuts so that they count for one country or another. And the other one is setting up a new baseline for the amount of climate finance that's expected to go to middle-income and poorer countries.
And you say this is to deal with the last hanging issues from 2015 and the Paris Climate Agreement. But of course, Donald Trump is going to be a new issue again in that agreement. He pulled the US out of it when he became president last time. What effect is it likely to have that he's going to be president again?
Well, I think you'd be hard put to find anyone in the climate world who was excited about the prospect. There are various things to look at. One is that, yes, Mr. Trump's campaign has suggested that his administration would again pull out of the Paris process. There's also the fact that he's very, very keen on producing hydrocarbons in the United States. Now, how much of a difference that makes is slightly unclear in that America already produces more oil and gas than any other country. And it's not clear that there's been a huge amount of restraint under Mr. Biden's administration, but there is still room for relaxing various regulations, and there's the possibility of increasing the capacity to export natural gas. Not sure, though, whether there's that much likelihood of huge cuts in the pro-renewables side of the Biden policy, not least because the money encouraging the use of renewables in the United States is currently being spent predominantly in states which voted Republican. The state that's doing the most in terms of crowding on renewables is Texas.
Will he actually pull out of the Paris Agreement again, do you think?
I think there's a good chance he will, yes, because his campaign has said that he's going to, and that's not necessarily an indicator, but it's got to be more an indicator than not. He's unlikely, I think, to say, I was wrong about that. That's not a very Trumpy thing to say. And in terms of sort of owning the libs, it's a very effective strategy. So, yeah, I think there's a very good chance that he will pull out of the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement can continue without America. It did it sort of before. It's not an entirely new prospect, and America's not, in this respect, an indispensable nation. America could, in some scenarios, omit billions of tons more carbon dioxide over the next 4 years than it might have done. And that is, of course, a distressing prospect. America will now be far and away the largest country that will not meet the goal that it communicated to the Paris process, its so-called nationally determined commitment, in terms of cutting carbon emissions. And there's no way that that's good, but there's also no way that it's a hole beneath the waterline that leads to unavoidable doom.
Okay, so let's turn to what you said actually is on the agenda this time. Explain to me what is needed in terms of climate finance and how it's going to happen.
Well, what is needed in terms of climate finance is money for three different things. One is to allow poorer countries to invest in cleaner power sources so that they reduce their own emissions. There is also the need to move them away from emitting sources in terms of what's sometimes called global public goods. And there's also the need to help with adaptation to the climate change that is at this stage inevitable, of which there is distressingly still quite a lot. So those three different bags have to be filled in different ways, and there are different mechanisms for doing so. And what are called the new collective quantified goals, which will replace the previous ad hoc goal of trying to get the flow of funding to the global south up to $100 billion. The notion of how big they will be is what's under negotiation, and also how they will get paid at Baku.
So where do you think that all leaves the ambition, indeed the target of staying below a 1.5 degree increase from pre-industrial levels?
I think 1.5 is probably better seen as a limit than a target. If you look at the wording of the Paris Agreement, and the Economist website, incidentally, has a very nice annotated version of the Paris Agreement to make this easier for you, you see that the parties to the agreement committed themselves to keeping the rise in temperatures well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial and making efforts for 1.5. There are no plausible efforts left at the moment that will stop the world from going over 1.5. We said this on the cover of the paper a couple of years ago. There has been no reason to change that analysis. The amount of permissible emissions left before the world is pushed 50-50 over 1.5 is just about 6 years of emissions now. 1.5 is going to be exceeded. It's possible the world might later find ways to come back to 1.5, but 1.5 is going to be exceeded. And this is a problem in more than one way. Obviously, one way is that more warming is more suffering and more need for spending on adaptation, and generally in that respect, a bad thing. A subtler thing is that the scale of the efforts that are needed to stay below 1.5 is so enormous that it can actually feel paralyzing. If you look at models of how the world might stay below 2 degrees, you find that it looks still incredibly daunting, but by no means as flat out impossible as staying below 1.5. And I do slightly wonder, it's very hard to actually assess whether the 1.5 limit is one that has almost paralyzed people by the size of the ask that it represents.
Ollie, is there any hope that renewables, which have become so much cheaper and more profitable, will help the transition away from fossil fuels?
Oh, there's more than hope, Rosie. They absolutely have to. But the problem here is that having cheap alternatives to fossil fuels is a necessary condition for stopping using fossil fuels or stopping the emissions from fossil fuels. But it's not a sufficient condition. I think the biggest thing that's happened since Paris, frankly, is the tumbling of the price of solar power and thus its vast expansion. This year, China is going to install more solar power within this year than the whole world had installed by the time of Paris. That's absolutely remarkable, but you need to have something more. You also need policies to try and get emissions out of the system. That's still possibly one of the biggest questions facing not just this COP, but the world as a whole as it tries to move forward.
Ollie, thank you very much for talking to me.
It's a great pleasure, Rosie.
And we'll have more on the COP29 summit, including how countries might meet their carbon reduction targets, on our sister shows Babbage on Wednesday and Money Talks on Thursday. If you aren't already a subscriber, search Economist Podcast Plus for a free trial.
In Renaissance-era Italy, artists were funded by wealthy patrons.
Henry Trix is our U.S. technology editor.
The famous Medici family, the bankers and effectively the rulers of Florence for 300 years, give or take a couple of brief intervals, began providing patronage to one of the city's most celebrated artists, Michelangelo, at the turn of the 16th century. In more recent years, a modern-day version of this patronage has been taking place in Silicon Valley. Since 2019, Microsoft has provided more than $13 billion in cash and computing capacity to OpenAI, which is one of the companies now at the forefront of generative artificial intelligence. This modern-day version of Renaissance patronage began when OpenAI was just a penniless startup. It's now worth $157 billion. And in return for its support, Microsoft has been granted the exclusive right to run OpenAI's models on Azure, its cloud computing business. Some of the people close to OpenAI, its financial backers, its board members, now believe it's time for Microsoft to loosen its grip.
Well, Henry, up till now, it seems like both companies have been doing very well out of things as they are.
Sure, this has been, like the Medicis and Michelangelo, a wildly successful partnership. OpenAI, which is the company that created ChatGPT, has built bigger and better large language models, and Microsoft gets early access to them and has been able to incorporate them into those products that we all use, such as Office or Bing. It also sells them to third parties via its cloud computing business, Azure. This access to OpenAI's models has helped Azure narrow the gap with Amazon's cloud service, which is called Amazon Web Services. And there's a strange Renaissance-era analogy here too, because there is a bitter, almost hometown rivalry between Microsoft and Amazon, who are neighbors based near each other in Washington state. The thing is that Microsoft's Azure makes up less than half of the cloud computing market. And some of the people that I spoke to who are close to OpenAI are now looking greedily at the other half, which is controlled by Amazon. They think that if OpenAI could sell its models on Amazon, it would become almost unvanquishable. Revenues are already upwards of 3.5 billion. And given its huge valuation, these people would really like to see those revenues go a lot harder. And they think that Amazon is a springboard to that.
But surely Microsoft thinks that OpenAI is the crown jewels. It's not going to want to share its technology with that hometown rival.
It's not keen to share it at all. But ending its exclusive patronage of OpenAI isn't quite as crazy as it sounds. In the long run, Microsoft has equity in OpenAI, and it stands to benefit if OpenAI gets broader market access. Just the fact that OpenAI becomes more dominant in the space is going to increase its value to Microsoft. And there are also antitrust concerns that would be alleviated if it loosened the reins a bit. So America's Federal Trade Commission and Britain's Competition and Markets Authority have both opened inquiries into Microsoft and OpenAI's relationship.
Okay, so it's gone from sounding kind of unlikely to kind of good business. Do you think that's the way things are going?
There are things going on in the background that makes it seem more feasible. So Microsoft was really shocked a year ago when Sam Altman, who is OpenAI's boss and co-founder and sort of raison d'etre, he was suddenly ousted in this extraordinary boardroom coup, which lasted for a few days before he was quickly reinstated again. But the reverberations were pretty intense. And what they revealed was that Microsoft's huge investment in OpenAI is relatively fragile. And as a result, it's diversified. So since then, what you've seen is that it's added large language models from Mistral, a French AI firm, And in late October, it also said it would start selling a variety of other AI models, including one from Anthropic, which is OpenAI's biggest rival. Microsoft and OpenAI are in the process of renegotiating the terms of their relationship. So there's a lot of flux in this relationship too.
And Amazon greedily eyeing what it might be able to get, I imagine.
You bet. Amazon may be the biggest in terms of cloud computing, but companies tend to think first of Azure because Microsoft has OpenAI, and second, they think of Google Cloud Services because it has its own big models such as Gemini, whereas AWS, Amazon's cloud company, doesn't have its own AIs. It doesn't have its own large language models to compete with OpenAI or Google. It offers a variety of models, and adding OpenAI would probably attract a lot more customers. I recently put the question to AWS's boss, Matt Garman, and he was clearly struck by the idea of having OpenAI on board.
I would love for OpenAI to run in AWS. We want to work with every single partner out there, but they have to be willing to want to work with us.
So he wouldn't be drawn onto how likely it was.
So what's developing here is something more like a free market economy for this generative AI stuff. Do you think if OpenAI is let loose on Amazon, perhaps elsewhere, it might end up outcompeting all these other models anyway?
That's the excitement amongst those who back OpenAI. They think of it as potentially being the one model to rule them all. There is plenty of competition. Model makers are currently leapfrogging each other every 2 weeks or so in terms of who has the latest and the greatest new development. And so the kind of open approach that Amazon is embracing, offering its customers all sorts of models, that may prevail. Increasingly, you see that companies want access to a variety of cloud providers. They want access to a variety of AI models. So, like the Medicis, I guess Microsoft deserves credit for spotting creative genius early on. But I don't think that its hold over OpenAI is going to last forever.
Henry, thanks very much for your time.
Jason, great talking to you.
If you've ever been in Britain in November, looked at a lapel and wondered why the poppy is the flower pinned to it, then the answer is corpses and chemistry.
Catherine Nixie writes about Britain for The Economist.
Today, the poppy is indelibly associated with Flanders fields. But in fact, it shouldn't really be. The soil there is far too poor for them. But from 1914 onwards, there was, in the corner of that foreign field, a richer dust concealed. Or, to put it more bluntly, there were corpses. Rotting, festering, fly-blown, blackened corpses, decomposing and covering the mud in what Siegfried Sassoon called plastering slime. The soldiers were repulsed, but the poppies flourished.
If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, wrote one soldier in 1915. Between the crosses, row on row. The rise of the poppy as a symbol for remembrance happened organically and very quickly. That poem became a sensation, and the poppy soon became a symbol of remembrance. It still is. Poppies are sold every year by the Royal British Legion. They raise money for veterans and for serving soldiers. They're worn everywhere. They're worn by politicians, by newsreaders. They're sewn into the shirts of footballers. You can see them on street corners and on lorries and on car radiators and on coats. 30 million poppies are sold in Britain alone, in paper and plastic and metal. Slightly unexpectedly, this supposed symbol of peace has now become an issue in the culture wars. To Today, poppies don't just raise money, they also raise hackles. Keir Starmer was criticised last month when he didn't wear one during a video about Islamophobia. Other people have been criticised for wearing them too often. It is, say their critics, ostentatious. For wearing them too little, it's callous. Or not at all, which is worse. There have been rows over red poppies, which some see as too bloodthirsty, pacifist white poppies, too sappy, LGBT rainbow poppies, too woke, and black poppy roses, ditto. The Royal British Legion attempts to rise above it. It says that wearing a poppy is personal choice. But for other people, it started to feel discomfortingly unclear what you commemorate when you pin on a poppy. Is it the First World War? The Second? The Culture Wars? The rise of the poppy's status as a symbol was organic and, in the beginning, almost entirely uncontested. In the trenches, soldiers loved poppies. They knew they grew, as one poet put it, with their roots in men's veins, but they adored them anyway. Soldiers picked poppies, they painted them, they pressed them, they put them in vases in their dugouts. And then in 1915, a soldier called John McCrae wrote a poem about them. His friend had just been killed, and he had had to bury him. The friend had been so badly blown up by a shell that they less buried him as a body than poured him into sandbags and then shaped him into a human form. The next day, McCrae tore a page from his dispatch book and he started to write. "We are the dead," he wrote. And then, a bit more marketably, "In Flanders fields, the poppies blow." The poem was published in Punch in 1915. By the end of the 1920s, around 500,000 poppy wreaths were being made in London every year. The ones worn today are almost identical to the first ones. There's some small changes. The early poppies were sewn out of silk. Now they're made in factories, punched from rolls of paper like jam tarts from pastry. But overall, this seems like a story then of stasis. But actually, it isn't. In 1919, 6 million men, a third of all British males, had just served in the First World War. The last veteran of the trenches, Harry Patch, died in 2009. The last Spitfire ace died in 2020. The last original SAS member died in January. This matters. Remembrance is a very different thing if there is no one left alive who remembers the war that you're commemorating. In the years since the wars, there's grown a newly aggressive attitude towards commemorating the wars. It seems to be linked to nostalgia, which, proud and often pernicious, is flourishing in British politics. It is not surprising that the poppy has been co-opted into this culture war. All history is contemporary history, said the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce. And so all historical symbols are too. And the poppy is just one more of them. The world wars aren't pure history yet. Some veterans still survive. Like Waterloo or Trafalgar, these wars will soon become the pure past. And the meaning of the poppy will change once again. "We are the dead," McCrae wrote. Now, they almost all are.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. Let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcasts@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.